Welcome. I would like to thank Contending Foundation for organizing this conference, and it's a great pleasure for me to take part in this conference and to moderate this panel with distinguished speakers. As we are running out of time, I'll be quick. I'm Asena Günal. I work as the director of Anadolu Kültür, which is an NGO working in the field of culture and arts to promote dialogue, reconciliation, and understanding. It has an art center in down the hill called Depo. At Depo, we have been organizing exhibitions, screenings, and panels. And we have an art center in Diyarbakır where Kurdish and Turkish people come together, especially to produce films, photographs, and literary works together. So the title of this panel is Şehir Müzeleri. Sorry, I'm without the English version of it. There will be presentations on city museums. This is also in Turkish. Anyway, the distinguished speakers are from different city museums. And we will start with Sarah Henry. She is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Museum of the City of New York, where she has served since 2001. There she oversees all museum programs, including exhibitions, public programs, and publications. She's also responsible for the exhibition department's program strategy, long-range planning, and budgeting. She recently led the curatorial team for the museum's acclaimed new three-gallery signature exhibition, which is called New York at its Core, and which opened in November 2016. Dr. Henry received PhD in American history from Columbia University and studied history, maths, and philosophy at Yale. So I'm giving the floor to her.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, an honor to be with such a distinguished group, and I really want to thank the foundation and especially Nayat for organizing such a brilliantly curated and organized event. And I also want to thank all the speakers we've heard so far today. You've already enriched my understanding and challenged me to think about how to deepen my practice. And my presentation's now twice as long as it was before we heard this morning's presentations. No, not right. Just briefly, the Museum of the City of New York is not a memory site. It's a place that is about a city, not about a tragedy, although we have lots of tragedies and difficult histories within our city. So being invited to speak at this conference actually gave me a great opportunity to take a little step back and think afresh about some of the ways that we deal with the challenges at our museum, and to think about the strategies that we use to deal with difficult histories. And it's been helpful to me, and I hope that it will be helpful and instructive to some of you. For those of you not familiar with the Museum of the City of New York, a very quick introduction. We were founded in 1923, so coming up to our centennial, as the first city museum in the United States. So the idea of a city museum is very familiar to people from other parts of the world, but not so in the United States, and still to this day, we need to explain to most Americans what a city museum is. We're located on Fifth Avenue and 104th Street at the juncture between East Harlem and the Upper East Side. And with typical New York bravado, we describe our mission as fostering the understanding of the distinctive nature of urban life in what we immodestly call the most influential metropolis in the world. And very importantly, to celebrate, document, and interpret the city's past, but also its present and its future, which is very relevant, I think, to the conversations that we are having at this conference today. As was mentioned already, we do this through exhibitions and lots of other programming and our permanent gallery, as well as some 8 to 10 temporary exhibitions a year. So I'd like to start by just giving some thoughts and reflections on the relationship of a city museum to this idea of difficult histories, to lay some groundwork for the examples that I'll show you and some of the techniques that I would like to share with you. So first of all, as the title of this session suggests, a city museum is about a locality. It's about the particulars of the place that we serve. We are a general museum about a specific place. That means that this place is filled with our own difficult histories, which sometimes are principally legible and of interest to local people. But cities are not just localities, and a city museum is not just does not just tell local stories. We at the Museum of the City of New York are interested in the urban condition, and interested in talking about the things that cities share, and actually investigating the nature of urban life itself. And central to that is that a central feature of cities that is that a city is a crossroads among people and ideas and economies. And that especially means that as we look at the stories of New York, we're talking about the ways in which New York in many ways is a microcosm of much larger stories, and that way that, and in that regard, we reflect bigger stories. So what I've been thinking about as we thought about this conference is the ways in which New York and other global cities like it share the legacies and the struggles of grand national and international historic events, and how we have to contend with histories that go well beyond our borders. The next thing that I wanted to just put on the table is that as a city museum, I believe that we have a special, though not unique, relationship to contemporary issues. As a place that essentially has a civic mission, we partially exist to engage the citizens of the city in conversations about the future, about what is happening today. So we are about not just how did we get here, but where are we going? And at the Museum of the City of New York, we have a whole gallery dedicated to the future of the city, which was a big move for us, but an important one that is really a conversation about engaging people in questions about values, norms, and what we want to be as a city, not to predict what we will be. It seems to me that as a result of this configuration of concerns that the City Museum embodies, we have a special challenge when it comes to the topic of this conference and these difficult histories. Because we're not a memory site, but we're a museum that takes on the story of a place, not a story of a group of people, not the story of an event, or a discipline or a single field of study. We have a very particular relationship to our audience. They are our visitors, and they're also the subject of our museum. And in a way, we have a special mandate to represent as fully as possible the full range and diversity of New York's residents. And that means that we have a lot to balance, because New York is a very, very diverse place that truly does represent the world in many ways. And it means that as the Museum of the City of New York, we have to reflect the ways in which diversity, while it can promote tolerance, or at least toleration, it can also concentrate the politics and the dynamics of difference. Things can become so compacted and concentrated that sometimes conflict gets magnified in our urban place. So we have to face the fact that our museum, as this museum of the city, simultaneously belongs to everyone and to no one. And that said, I'd like to move on to two broad categories of difficult histories that we engage in our programming. These two types of difficult histories are not mutually exclusive, but it helped me to think about it in two categories. The first one are the traumatic histories, which are akin to many of the ones that we've spoken about today. They're ones that involve the history of harm in some way. And the second category that I'll talk about are contested histories. Obviously, these are overlapping categories, but I think they raise somewhat different methodological issues for us as a museum. So to start with the traumatic histories, these are histories of tragedies, of disasters, of violence, hatred, exploitation, discrimination, exclusion, all of these painful topics that we've already been talking about at this conference. In many ways, these are the things that we share with other institutions that we've already heard from. Although, as I mentioned before, our relationship to them as a city museum may be rather different than for an institution whose mission is dedicated to exploring these kinds of tragedies. So, as I mentioned before, we're talking about places where people have experienced harm at the hands of others or of nature or other places. We have to recognize when we confront these histories as a museum of the City of New York that they have the potential to traumatize or re-traumatize our visitors, and to think about that, which has already been mentioned by others. But we also have a special challenge because our visitors are coming to visit a general museum. They are not coming prepared, perhaps, as they might to a place that's associated specifically with tragedy that they've elected to come to and have made that choice and have prepared themselves for. Here they may be coming to think just more generally about the city. And so we want to think a lot about how we deal with difficult histories and not spring it on people who are unwilling or unprepared. So here are a few examples of things that we've dealt with over the years that I've been at the Museum of the City of New York. In the area of traumatic violence, I actually began working at the Museum of the City of New York in June of 2011, just before the attacks on the World Trade Center. But some of these traumatic histories are much older. So we deal, for example, with the riots that took place during the Civil War, which were the most violent civil unrest in the United States history. We deal with the founding sins of the American nation. So slavery, New York was a major slaveholding place, and of course the original sin of Native American genocide. And then we deal with disasters, so whether they are microbiological, like the AIDS tragedy, or natural and climate change driven, like the Superstorm Sandy, which devastated New York in 2012. You can see an image of the aftermath of it there. So how do we actually deal with these in terms of museum technique? I just want to run a few of the ways by you. And the first one starts with 9/11, which is simply the relationship of a museum to a trauma that's unfolding. We were on the spot when 9/11 took place. We were actually going to be moving down. We were just a few blocks from the World Trade Center when the planes hit. And we responded to this in a variety of ways, but just the thing I wanted to mention in particular was springing into action on collecting. So going down to ground zero, finding what among the debris should be saved, what about among the memorial items should be saved. And one of the things that I found helpful and comforting at the time, and maybe others have found this as well, is that in many ways this felt uncomfortable to us as museum people because our city was right in the midst of a tragedy, but our public was actually way ahead of us. So far from being seen as somehow inappropriate in a moment of tragedy that we would be thinking about collecting, our public really welcomed that and actually urged us forward on it. The next category on these traumatic histories is about how we exhibit them. And I think one of our central bywords is just respect. Respect for the story and respect for the visitor. I'm just going to show you quickly two examples about this. One is from our current exhibition called Germ City, Microbes and the Metropolis, which deals with a lot of scary stories about germs. And this figure that's shown here is this wax moulage of a face of a victim of smallpox. And what's hard to see here is that 3 sides of the box are frosted. So you can elect to go around and look at this artifact, and if you decide you don't want to look at it anymore, you can separate yourself from it. Similarly, in New York at its core, when we deal very briefly with 9/11, we've decided to select just one artifact and exhibit it by itself. It shows there on the right-hand side, it's a sign from the World Trade Center, giving it some space and not going too deep into interpretation, but giving people a place for kind of reflection without sort of being excessively didactic or emotional about it. The third technique here about traumatic histories is some things that are sometimes unintentionally traumatic. Or we had an exhibition on the history of Yiddish theater in New York, and this set design featured in it, which we blew up to life size on this proscenium, featured an image that is very triggering for a lot of people. It's part of the troubling history of blackface in the United States. And so that figure there, just acknowledging the traumatic nature of it and interpreting it and giving it context within the text was very important to us. We use art and contemporary art to provide a kind of humanistic and emotional bridge to difficult histories. So for example, in our exhibition, AIDS at Home, Art and Everyday Activism, we used contemporary art to encounter these difficult emotions through the artist's point of view. And in the exhibition I mentioned before, Germ City, AIDS at Home, this is a piece called Blood Mirror about the ban on gay men donating blood. That's by a contemporary artist. So these provide multiple ways into very complicated stories. The final thing I want to say about these traumatic histories is to think a little bit about the way we represent the people who are affected by them. So it's very important to us, and this is an image from New York at its core, showing interactive portraits of individual New Yorkers, some of whom were really, whose voices are not heard. So on the left of the screen is Jenny June, a transgender person, woman from the late 19th century, so bringing her story to life. The story of Chinese New Yorkers in the 19th century, a very oppressed minority, and being able to use their words and their stories as individuals to honor them. And then a related technique is to bring out the quotations and actual voices. In this case, the story of the Lenape people who were occupied the land before the Europeans arrived, and their voice about their experience. And finally, an interesting project we did in association with Germ City, which is a co-creation piece where this is work done by contemporary Native Americans living in New York today, who through the American Indian Community House did work on the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And the presentation of their work was kind of a public collecting co-creation project, gave their voices a place to shine. And my last piece on the dealing with trauma is on a point that was raised actually in the last panel, which is how do you tell these stories of harm being done to people without re-victimizing them? So the example that I wanted to bring out is the way that we deal with the story of slavery in New York in our core exhibition. This is a ankle shackle. It was used for a child. It was unearthed in Lower Manhattan. But we were really advised by our academic panel to make sure that we told the story of African Americans during slavery in New York, not just with the eye to their victimization, but to their agency. So these are some other examples of material that appears along with these kinds of stories about slavery that speak to the agency and the individual lives of free and enslaved people to make sure that they appear as full humans and not just the objects of their subjugation. So, my second section about divisive histories. So, histories can be divisive for a variety of ways. They could be divisive for us because they tap into contemporary politics. This is a case study we have in a gallery about social activism in New York, about the movement for Black Lives, which is a very charged topic in the United States right now. And here is another case study from the same gallery, which is which is about the proposed mosque near Ground Zero. History can be divisive because it's about conflict. I'll skip ahead so I can get to the techniques. And it can be divisive because there are a variety of ways to interpret that history. So it can be historiographically contested. So here are some of the ways that we have, I'm going to go ahead to my examples here. I'll just point out one thing before I dive into my techniques. When an issue is contested and people have starkly different points of view who may be walking across our threshold, we want to think about where we leave room for difference of opinion and how we give ownership to people whose community's story we're telling. And this raises great opportunities and great challenges, because the question of who actually speaks for the community can often become very challenging and problematic. So one way we do this is we include multiple voices in our exhibitions, showing multiple sides of the story. We embrace debate as a topic of our exhibitions, so explaining that the controversy itself is the story that we want to tell. We invite multiple perspectives in our future city lab. And then the thing I really wanted to tell this group about is the way that we've been thinking about sharing authority and bringing in community groups to speak about histories that are part of their lived experience and their memories and their families' memories. So who is the community? We just opened an exhibition about cycling in New York, and there we engaged a variety of cycling subcultures and activists, brought them in for a community conversation before we finished the curation of the exhibition, and thought about different ways that their different perspectives could shed light on the politics of bicycling in New York. And my last example is our most recent and our most challenging. So we're working on an exhibition now about Native New Yorkers today, looking at art that speaks to their identity in the urban landscape. This is not from our exhibition. This is from a protest at the American Museum of Natural History by Native people, also people from the Movement for Black Lives, around the question of representation in the American Museum of Natural History. So we've been looking to, and we are convening a community advisory group from the Native community, but who is the Native community? It is, the question of Native identity is deeply tied up in the complex history of the United States. It's been contested since its inception. The question of who counts as a Native person got wrapped up in federal law, actually even before the revolution. It's deeply wrapped up in big issues around funding, relations with the federal government. It's deeply wrapped up in the question of the sovereignty of the Native nations. And so the questions that now we have to face as the Museum of the City of New York is, who do we include? And believe me, the people who we're talking to do not agree on how to make that decision. Is it about people who are affiliated with federally recognized tribes? Does this have something to do with the controversial idea of blood quantum? Does it have to do with who you were raised by? How Indian do you have to be to count? So I just wanted to sort of leave that as a thought, to say that on the road to community engagement and to shared authority are a lot of methodologically challenging questions that I truly believe are worth navigating, but they are all the more charged when the histories that we're telling are so traumatic. And sometimes the good intentions can bring you to surprising places. So maybe in the question and answer, we can talk a little bit about some of the techniques like public programs on controversial topics and the ways that we invite participation in our galleries as a way to kind of democratize what we're doing. But I think I'm out of time, and I think I will leave it there.